In recent history, the world has been hit by several pandemics affecting millions of people. Of course, in our lifetime, COVID-19 has demonstrated that despite huge scientific and medical advances, the potential for diseases to spread is increasing. Factors including globalization and connectivity have played a role in the increase and frequency of pandemics. So let's take a look at how best the world can prepare for future pandemics. We're joined by Precious Matsoso, who is the Director of the Health Regulatory Science Unit at Wits University. She's also a member of the Independent Panel for Pandemic Preparedness and Response. Precious, it's great to talk to you. Thanks very much for coming on. How quickly we forget, right, that just a couple of years ago we were caught in the grips of the COVID-19 pandemic.
Yes, certainly. I mean, is amnesia at its best. As you know, we have lost millions, over 7 million deaths. And in any event, access deaths are even more. But what I wanted to emphasize is that that happened against the backdrop of us having international health regulations that all 194 member states had to comply with. 194 countries had signed up to these international health regulations. But of course, it was identified that they were inadequate. It is for that reason that there was a call for their amendment. But even with the amendment, because of inequitable access to vaccines and diagnostics, there was a further call for the world to come up with the pandemic treaty, which I've been co-chairing for the past 2 years. And the reason is because there's an understanding that countries need sovereignty in terms of vaccine supplies. And for that to happen, there must be technology transfer, and there must also be diversified production, particularly in the African region, because we have to reach 60% of the needed supplies in the continent. And we've seen with COVID that these supplies did not come through, particularly to our region. And it is for that reason that this pandemic treaty is addressing issues of equity that we saw were highly deficient during the COVID pandemic.
It's a difficult sort of duality to be faced with, isn't it? That we have all of these incredible scientific advances, and yet in 2024, and I suppose, you know, in 2020, 2019, 2020, we were more at risk of the pitfalls of dealing with a pandemic, with a global health crisis, than we've ever been before, these incredible advances in science.
Well, I guess, I mean, in South Africa, we've had our own experiences, though not to such a scale. I mean, the HIV/AIDS is an experience where we've seen what inequitable access could result in particular, people who didn't have access, I mean, were sentenced to death. We saw that happen. And I think this should never be repeated again. Even with those lessons, we see that even with an unprecedented, research and development for new vaccines, access was still a problem. So we need a balance between innovation and access. So both are two sides of the same coin.
And I suppose, Precious, this first ever global pandemic accord that the World Health Assembly is drawing up. We now know that negotiations have been extended to next year, May. But I imagine one of the key things that will be included in this accord is exactly what you've said, equal access to vaccines. And of course, we know that's not what we saw during the start of COVID-19, when we were all waiting for this vaccine to be developed. And then when the first one was approved, we saw wealthier nations stockpiling. In fact, some of the information here says that about 1.3 million people died in lower income countries as a result of inequitable access to these life-saving vaccines.
Certainly, and it is for that reason that we say this time around, even if the well-established economies decide to produce for their own citizens, they should at least do one thing, and one thing only: allow for technology transfer that will enable diversified production. Because in that case, in the African region, we can then have, within a regional context, production, at least of supplies, that can be distributed across the whole region. We don't have to wait for supplies from other well-established economies. If they are going to prioritize their populace, I think it's within their right to do so. But at least as they do that, they must do two things. One, if they have access, as it has been debated during these negotiations, if they can access a pathogenic material, biological material, genetic sequencing from countries, at least that must be matched with benefits. And I think this is the heart of the debate and discussions, that any access to materials, it should be matched with benefits. And I think those benefits can be defined, whether they're monetary or non-monetary. It can be also about technology transfer, for instance, or it can be also about capacity building, particularly strengthening capacity in some of our institutions.
So what have been some of the successes of drawing up this pandemic accord, Precious?
Well, the first one that actually heartens and make me it really is humbling is the first article that was approved. Is that one that deals with the health workforce. As you know, the health workers were at the front line of the pandemic, and they will always be. They're the first port of call when we're hit with outbreaks. And it is for that reason that they should be the first to get protection, personal protection equipment. If there are vaccinations, they must be the first to be vaccinated. They must be the first to be diagnosed, so that at least they must be able to protect others. So it is the first article that was approved, and I was actually happy that that happened. The second is the one on finance. I mean, without finance, we can't do anything. And for that reason, the finance is almost agreed. I think we're only left with one issue. And this is about whether there should be additional funds or not. And of course, I think there should be. But as you may recall, during this period, the pandemic fund was created, and there's been an argument that the governance of the pandemic fund must be improved, but it's a good start and it's something that we can work from. But however, there are certain elements of the pandemic fund that needs to be improved. As to whether it should be incorporated into the pandemic agreement, others are saying because we want a future-proof rule-based system. If you write pandemic fund today, in future we may need something else. Perhaps we need to describe it more generically. Talk about coordinating financing mechanisms that are sustainable and predictable, so that in future, when we are hit with the pandemics like COVID, we'll be able to respond. As you may recall, preparedness was grossly underfunded.
Yeah.
And at least this financing will ensure that we're better prepared, better funded in future. So those are the two key. But of course, there are others that must still be addressed. Like I say, technology transfer, pathogen access and benefit sharing. Once those are resolved, I think, in my opinion, and as well as One Health, because of zoonotic related spillovers, like mpox, as you heard earlier. Once those are agreed, I think this agreement will be reached, and I'm confident that this will be arrived at by the end of this year or early next year.
And I suppose it goes without saying, Precious, that even with the pandemic accord, countries will have learned from the struggles that they faced during COVID-19, and, for example, have started to begin to work towards having the infrastructure to develop and to manufacture their own vaccines, and to have their own pandemic funding, sort of a rainy day fund, so to speak, a rainy day fund of the worst kind, as a country, not only as part of the accord, but all of those things to try and put those kinds of frameworks in place to be prepared as South Africa, for example.
Absolutely. In fact, it is for that reason that we have said domestic financing is crucial. Countries can't just wait for handouts. They have also a responsibility towards their own populations, and they have to ensure that they make wise investments. And wise investments means that they can put money where it matters most to ensure prevention and as well as preparedness. But of course, you'll realize that during the recovery phase and inter-pandemic, countries have to prepare. They shouldn't prepare when we're already in crisis. That's not the proper way to respond to pandemics. I think when we're still, we call it during peace times. During peace times, this is where these investments should be made. And we should also deal with governance. I always say that pandemics starts in communities and they end in communities. So if we don't invest in our communities, we will be half prepared. We need to invest in our communities so that they can be better informed, information can be shared rapidly, quickly, and also use whatever structures. A government alone cannot win this fight. It needs a coordinated effort of different stakeholders, and those structures must be in place well in advance, and we need to ensure that there are good governance mechanisms that can protect the whole system and help us to better respond.
So we've got now until May 2025 to finalize this pandemic accord, Precious. Where do some of the stumbling blocks, in your opinion, still lie?
Well, I'm pleased to say that 17 articles have been agreed and they've been confirmed, and I'm pleased with that. But of course, there are 17 others that are partially agreed. And that partial agreement means there's still a bit of work to be done. The key ones that are very difficult, and I'm hoping that there'll be a solution, are those that deal with access and benefit sharing, as I indicated earlier. The second is about technology transfer. There are those who argue that technology transfer must be on mutually agreed terms, and it must also be voluntary. Others are saying tech transfer, you can't be dictating. Let's just have technology transfer depending on the circumstances. You can then make a determination then and not be prescriptive in law. And if we can resolve that, I think the provisions on technology transfer will be finalized. But of course, there's an ongoing debate. You may be aware of that on intellectual property rights. This is an ongoing debate about whether the TRIPS agreement that has been agreed to years ago requires adequate safeguards for those who do research and development, whilst ensuring that access is not impeded. And I think, if we can agree on the language to recognize that, yes, research and development is needed, but to just come up with new products that are not accessed is not useful at all. We must ensure that there are access provision that will ensure that people, when needed, can access those products. Then the last one, I think, is on One Health. There's a nexus between human health, animal health, and environmental health. You've seen with the disasters, every time we have disasters, you are likely to get cholera outbreaks. So you cannot rule out any environmental factors and the impact on health. And also animal health, we note with zoonotic diseases, mpox is a case in point. We have H5N1. We have to ensure that we're better prepared. So we can't have surveillance systems that deal with one aspect. They need to be integrated across board so that we can respond adequately. But developing countries have argued that they do not have sufficient resources to build those systems. And I think it's a question of partnership to see which countries, how best can they be supported and helped to set up those integrated surveillance systems for them to be better prepared.
Precious Matsoso, it's been a great pleasure talking to you this afternoon. What a nightmarish thought, another pandemic, but preparedness is everything. Precious is the director of the Health Regulatory Science Unit at Wits University. She's also a member of the Independent Panel for Pandemic Preparedness and Response.